welcome to another episode of Aquarian Light. Today's episode is called The Alien Connection. This is a topic that comes up so much for a lot of people. We seem to have this innate fascination for aliens. We are curious about the unknown, and we hear lots of stories, lots of rumors, maybe bits and pieces of information that we find in the media, or we have this perception that there's some kind of information suppression, and that makes us all the more curious. So today we're going to dive into this topic and look to see how we relate to it and what information we can uncover from what we've intuited and see how all of this comes together. So Donis has a lot of experience with different alien topics. Can you start by giving us a run through on what is some of the information out there that people generally think, oh, I know about aliens, this is what the story is. So maybe not necessarily what's known to be true, but just what the general view out there is.
Yeah, I think first I'll start with a little bit of a disclaimer, actually. This is a fascinating topic, but we've sort of touched on it a little bit before in prior episodes. I know we spoke about the Orion Wars and actually intentionally sidestepped this issue, so we come back to it. Also, I mean, we've talked about like Star Wars and things of that nature which relate to things in outer space, obviously that being from a fantasy point of view, but maybe with some basis in some reality and that sort of nature. And I just wanted to stress that, you know, with these types of things, it could be a sensitive topic for some, and it's important to remember that when we're dealing with beings of a higher dimensions and higher, I guess, sort of sense of existence, that when we're going to these realms or we're having these experiences, that what we see is very subjective. I've spoken on this in the past in the sense of someone with the filters of a heavy religious background may see angels and demons, where another person may see aliens, another may see like AI, archons, things of that nature. All of these things, in a sense, these superior beings are beings of light, right? So our perception of them is really, we're seeing either through our filters or they show themselves to us in a sense of what they know will be comfortable in understanding what they are. So I don't know, it doesn't really matter in the sense that either or, right? It's pretty much basically the same concept. But we have to understand that there's a lot of subjectivity that comes through with these things. So I try to, for me personally, my person, luckily for everybody in this episode, actually does tend to see the cosmos in alien, I guess the general alien, galactic federation, these types of beings in my internal experiences. I've encountered some.
As in, that's how it manifests.
Yeah,
for
that's
you
how it
in your
manifests for me.
perception?
So I do have some stories, but I do try to not get too much into the subjectivity. I'm sure many of you could go watch YouTube channels or like shows on certain TV stations, and you know they'll talk about certain principles, which I'll talk about, that are more like universal, that tie into the universal esoteric principles, because pseudoscience actually does tie in very well, just like everything else. Those threads are everywhere, right? But then, you know, they'll feed you something that is very plausible or even, I mean, well, it is true, but I mean, like, it's based on something that's based on truth. And then they'll instantly then, you know, well, you've fed into this, you buy into this. Now we're going to go down a subjective rabbit hole where we're just going to spiral and go down this path of things that, like, I mean, I'm not even saying that these people that say are contactees or even people that have internal experience, that's not what they have not experienced. But what they're not understanding from their level of understanding is that it's all subjective. So what they see, you know, it will not be the same thing another person sees. So really, it doesn't really matter, a lot of the information. And in a sense, at least for me, right, certainly, you know, when I encounter superior beings, they may appear a certain way, but I always kind of like to put it in this sense. If one is to come across an omnipotent being who is all-knowing and has all these answers in the cosmos, right, perhaps, you know, we have to ask ourselves what inside of us cares about what type of clothing they may wear in their home planet, or what are their social structures, instead of, maybe asking them the mysteries of the universe. So I tend to, look for things that are more pertinent towards the actual spiritual path and developing as a soul. So not saying I don't see these things, but I don't really, pay attention to what belt this alien manifests, or this being manifests when it appears in front of me. So
Right.
I won't go into too much details like that. There's plenty of stuff for that if that's what you're looking for, is the intellectual, junk food, per se, right? To follow, there's plenty of channels that will like go into that and go into detail about, all these subjective details that, like I said, relatively may be true for that person. I'm not even saying that these people are lying, but what's relatively true for someone else may not be relatively true for you, and that's not what we're really concerned about here, So
Okay, so I thought that that was going to be something that we would come to later, just because once we know that, then the next question is why would we be interested in aliens at all? So I'm just going to recap what you said as I've heard it. You've basically said that people will have experiences with these different beings, say they believe they're from other planets, and their experiences that here is this being, they look like this, they come from this planet, and their intention is ABC. Now, in a subjective view, someone could see them as aliens, but if you go high up enough, they're essentially a light being that when someone has their lens of subjectivity, they may view them as aliens, and then another person will view them as an archon, and another person will view them as an angel or a demon. But high up enough, it is a light being, a light structure, an intelligence that our own overlay causes us to have a particular perception, a particular interaction with that energetic being.
yeah, I mean, absolutely. And in that sense too, I mean, there are also, right, there are beings, uh, sometimes we like to use the term humanities, from other worlds, right, that may be not all the way up to being light beings, right? Maybe they're, and I'll go into a little bit my experiences which with different types of things, but we talk about star seeds and things of that nature, right? People saying they've incarnated from some of these humanities and or these extraterrestrial species, and you can, some of them are also still maybe trapped within the matrix. Kind of, we talked about the spiral path and the direct path, and how there's existences that we could live in, say, in the fourth and fifth dimension. Again, beings that we can't necessarily perceive with our three-dimensional senses, but they're maybe more akin to what humanity may evolve into on this planet as it goes along. Maybe they're planets at a further stage of development, or they're an earlier stage of development before they have fully descended down.
Okay, hang on. So they're beings from a further stage of development, and they've come back in time? Is that what you've said?
I didn't say anything about traveling in time per se, but there is some certain things like that. We brought that up in the Orion Wars episode, where there is definitely, some semblance of some things of that nature going on, that maybe, remember, these beings live outside of time, so there's timelines, say, per where some catastrophe might happen, and then they use their technology to come back and prevent that from happening. In a sense, it's like, well, the event actually never really happened. We talked about this in the Orion Wars, where there's the midpoint in the universe is duality expressing, right? Because we are at where we are located in our present, the present moment that we're capturing right now, in our moment, how we view the present, we're in the first phase of that. So in this present now, the universe gets destroyed in an event, but because as the construct manifests, when we finally reach that point, there will be more conscious beings. The event won't even happen at all. So really, these missions and the things that are being sent back and forth, these beings already, everything has already manifested, because eternity already exists and we're here, right? So in a sense, that alternate timeline that these beings may be experienced, because they can travel through time, doesn't actually happen, because the mission has to be successful, because consciousness will express itself, and then eventually everything that comes from God will eventually return to God.
Okay, so we did talk about that, and that's the midpoint of the universe. These beings that wanted to prevent the destruction of the universe came back and took specific actions to raise the consciousness.
Well, there's definitely a semblance of something along those lines going on with beings of the sixth dimension that are living outside of the matrix. So these like architects of the construct itself that are trying to prevent this universe-ending event. If we get into it a little bit more, we talk about how things repeat at certain layers. So I'm sure many are familiar with gray aliens, and gray aliens are actually, can be different, from my understanding, right? Can be different species, right? But most people think of those little grays, the ones that are not even actually organic, right? For most people, the contactees that have met them, they're basically kind of like little robot suits with that you can upload a consciousness into, and maybe even being used and conscripted as workers for other aliens or things of that nature. And there's a theory out there that those gray aliens, for example, are us from the future in a timeline where we failed the ascension process and then became we went the opposite way, right? We aligned with the ego, the AI being basically our digitized version of the collective ego, right? That we created the ego in our own mind, right? We just aren't aware of it. And then with that ego, we then create the ego in a machine, but what we're really is just recreating our own consciousness or our lack of consciousness. We're recreating our own unconsciousness in a machine, right? And in an alternate timeline, allegedly, we, fully meld ourselves with artificial intelligence, thus losing our ability to reproduce. So then we have to come back to prevent whatever that, I guess, transhumanism movement type thing that we see going on right now from happening, which, I mean, from what my understandings and stuff that happens internally, I mean, it's all plausible, right? If it's related to the experiences I had related to the Orion Wars, then one, like we said, things always are repeating on different layers of the construct, right? So why not, if it's happening universally, why not couldn't happen planetary-wise? That's just a lower octave of that. But then there's also the fact of, I don't know if we haven't really talked about root races and things like that, but it was said in Atlantis, for example, they were able to have like android beings, or they could put the consciousness of, say, plants and animals within these machines, which is not that far off of a technology. So it's obviously possible.
So they put the elementals' consciousness into the robots.
So why wouldn't we be able to do that with a human consciousness?
But some of us have memories of a timeline when we merged with AI. So for those who have reclaimed these memories, how would it be that we find ourselves here?
Well, that comes back to the point of what I'm saying. So at these higher states, our being, our innermost, right? Our real us, the observer that's behind us, that's, driving this spacesuit, and having this experience through us, right, exists outside of time. So in a past life, and I talked about this in my own personal experience from the Orion Wars, time is not linear. So our linear past could be in an alternate future, right? Because the consciousness wants to experience all probabilities, right? So even a probability where the universe gets destroyed, even though it can immediately, right before the universe gets destroyed, go back in time to prevent it from happening, right? Like the event never actually occurs, right? Consciousness doesn't end itself. It wants to experience maybe the timeline in the scenario where that happens. And when you say that, oh, maybe someone experienced that in this case of the planet and merging with AI, like I said, that's why I think something like that could be totally plausible. In that it's just the same story replaying, but just for the Earth on a smaller scale, right? We talk about how all of these cycles of countries going up and down, civilizations going up and down, root races going up and down, the planet itself, going through cycles, the universe itself, all these cycles of duality, it happens at every layer, even to an extent. Not just our life and death as a being, but also our just waking up and going to sleep is like a mini life and death every single day, right? So everything is just recapitulating down the stream. So if this duality expresses in that way at a higher level outside of the time continuum, why wouldn't it experience? So when people are experiencing that type of like having those types of experiences, what's the difference between that and the experience that I'm having? Just like I said, at a different level of the construct, right? So, I mean, when people say that, for me, a lot of the things that I've experienced eternally would line up with confirmations of that.
Right. And then in some, say esoteric spiritual Teachings, they talk about how the essence or the seed of the soul has 108 lives as a human and has this chance to undertake the realization process. So if we were using this kind of an explanation, what is happening to the essence that is in that timeline that's been merged with AI and then comes back to try and change the timeline? What is going on in esoteric terminology?
I mean, in that sense, right? So obviously, this would be a soul that has at least achieved the spiral path, but they've achieved a certain level of awakening, right? The 108 lives is our ability to have a revolution internally, to awaken from the construct and to grow, right? And be that if someone is working directly and going straight up out of the matrix and unplugging and coming back to that being of light that's outside of the matrix, right? Like a spiritual master, something we consider master, or it's someone that is dissolves a little bit of their ego. They awaken enough that when they pass away, they're conscious in that pass away life, and then they go into, say, a life as a fifth dimensional being, live that life, and then eventually reincarnate back here to dissolve some more ego. Either way, you're going into a life that you're living outside of space and time. So again, linearly, your past life could easily be in the future, even if you hadn't completely come out of the construct. You could have had a past astral life that took place in an alternate timeline.
I see. That makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
So the essence is not trapped, merged with the AI if it failed.
Right.
And there's also an abyss there in that timeline, just in case it needs to be cleansed and come
Well,
back.
the abyss is also outside of space time, right? Because the abyss is the lower fifth dimension, so it's the lower astral.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Yes.
Okay. So is there any value in exploring the different types of aliens and that lore once we know that they're light beings and we're not fascinated with their clothing or what they eat? I mean, what that doesn't really have any impact on our own spiritual path. And like you said, someone who wants to explore that, they can go, and there's plenty of shows that go into that level of detail. What could we learn from looking at these different supposed species? You have these different groups and the Galactic Federation, and we've already acknowledged that that is a subjective lens and that at a high level, some of these are light beings that aren't necessarily an Andromedan as such.
Yeah.
So is there a value to
Well,
using that framework?
I certainly think there is a value to looking at it as, remember, everything that happens within happens without, as within, so without, as above, so below. To an extent, right? And like I said, this is just a subjective. This is, if you see it that way, sure. If you see it as angels and demons, but it'll still be just as valuable to you if you're seeing angels and demons. You just have to interpret it in your own filter, right? But there are beings that externally will represent these things. Why do they exist? Like I said, it's involved maybe with the spiral path, but also to a certain extent, if we think of like our cells in our body, like being the people and we being the cells of, say, a bigger organism like the planet, well, then maybe these other species, right, maybe represent a planet's egos, or like, because we know that the planet's own, or the solar system's egos, right, that depending on what level they're at, right, because the solar system, the planet, galaxies also have their own inner being, which is at a higher level of realization than the individual being in the person, but like it also thus needs to awaken, right? The part of the thing what I spoke about with the Orion Wars, right, is that it's not even that they're coming back in time to awaken people to prevent that event from happening, but it's coming back to awaken planets, which will awaken solar systems, because on a universal scale, they need to awaken a certain number of solar systems, have to become self-aware to prevent that from happening, right? So in a sense, maybe those beings are related to, say, like egos of the of the construct, like of higher beings or stuff like that. So if we look at it like that, then we can compare it to our own inner work and how these things work out, right? So, and also there's other esoteric value too. As I said, some of the lower beings, so beings of the fourth or fifth dimensional beings, can relate and show us. We could see the similarities to, say, prior root races on this planet, and it's just like confirmation things.
What's that connection? What's the connection? Because there's talk of previous races, and then there's a big narrative out there that you find in other spiritual communities about something to do with aliens and genetic manipulation. There's a lot of fear and confusion. How do these two things come together? Can they both be true?
So this is great. If we get into the ancient aliens topic, is cool. So, and again, right, the universal threads are everywhere. We could look at the universal threads to esotericism and the root races, and then compare them to the ancient astronaut theory, right? And actually, they line up quite well with each other. Again, subjectivity, we'll use different terminology, but if we actually look at it, they almost, I mean, it's basically the same story, right? Just, again, one's using angels and, whatever, cosmic beings that are angels, the Elohim and stuff, and then the others are using extraterrestrial beings. But this is where it gets like fascinating, and I think it's actually pretty cool when we look at it, and also in a sense too, right? So we're esoterically speaking at like the low point of this planet's devolution, right? The souls come down from the higher dimensions to help awaken the planet, and they start actually, like the first root race was said to be the polar race, right? They were fifth dimensional beings. They were ethereal. Couldn't even find them. And then as those races descended downwards into the physical, we reach a low point where then now when we turn back and ascend, we actually will ascend the planet's consciousness with us as well. That's why this process even has to happen. And all planets like go through this esoterically, right? So
So our low point is not a mistake.
I don't think so. I mean, sometimes esoterically speaking, they'll say, well, there is like a law of accidents and our planet's doing worse than others. But in a sense, like divinity, right, wants to have all the experience it possibly have. So that means it has to experience some races that have a smooth ascension and then others that go through a low point. Also, in a sense, esoterically speaking, there's a law of accidents. But the law of accidents is within the matrix, right? So that means outside of the architect realm of the causal realm, right, that there is no law of accidents. The law of accidents was put in by the architect. So it's not an accident that there is a law of accidents. Like there needs to be this randomness so that these things happen so that consciousness can have infinite amounts of experiences. Otherwise, everything would go exactly the same and there'd be no variation. There'd be no variables, right? So we need to, with that being said, when we look at some of these other beings, and I guess we'll start to point to some of the members of specific groups in like the Galactic Federation. There's certain humanoid fifth dimensional beings that tend to be like the contactees talk about them as the bridge for us to the species of a higher plane, but they tend to seem to represent humanities that were either prior to us or ones that may be coming in the future on this planet. As we know, we're moving back up towards the fifth dimension and things of that nature. And they seem to represent a good analogous thing for the evolution that happened on this planet. So you look at something like an Arcturian or I believe Syrians as well, right? These beings are almost humanoid. There's the Nordic looking ones. There's also the blue skinned aliens are also Arcturians, I believe, are the ones with the blue skin, but they also are humanoid. And in esotericism, we refer to them as humanities from other planets because they're basically a semi-physical, but they're a little bit more along advanced. Maybe they're planets back into the fifth dimension. They have these senses, and so they're more spiritually aware and all of this. They're further along in their evolution from whatever planet they came from, right? That would relate back to, say, some of our prior root races or what's to come, right? It was said, our first physical race that descended down, Lemurians, would have been still slightly, what's the word I'm looking for? They would have still been slightly
etheric,
yes, but that wasn't the word I was looking for. But yes, they'd still be submerged. There we go. So they'd be still slightly submerged in the etheric, and in fact, the lore said they had to be coaxed down to the physical because they didn't want to leave that because it's so great, But that, when I think of like the Arcturians or something like that, and how they're represented, it's a race like that. So they're physical, but like they're still connected to their spiritual faculties in the fifth dimension, and those races were said to still have technology to travel the stars because they had an understanding of the higher dimensions, which is
They were worthy.
well, it's what we need to actually travel through space time, right? We talk about the whether is it Star Trek or Star Wars, right? How like which one is depicting right how to travel through space? And the truth is, it's actually, from my understanding, both. There's both the folding of time into a wormhole, like if you're traveling long distances, but you could also when the UAPs or the UFOs, whatever, they change the name, right? When those are moving through our atmosphere and defying like the physics, right? That's that warp field, the warp field in Star Trek, where they create like a field around it that kind of makes a hole in the space-time fabric, so they don't have like the drag and they can just move in whatever
Are you talking
direction.
about where the space-time bends over, or that's something else? That's
With
a
space-
field around it.
Okay, so the Star Wars hyperspace is like you fold like space and then create like a wormhole through.
Yeah,
So that's like traveling
folding
far
over.
different. I'm saying the Star Trek is you create a field, generate a field around the vehicle so they could propel it faster than the speed of light.
Right.
But it's not going through a wormhole; it's moving like straight. And then that, in a sense, is probably it. I think how they move through. The technology moves through like the atmosphere without having like any of the effects of physics or gravity and all that, and they move at those ridiculous speeds and angles, right? And then when you're actually traveling between, like say, we were from one galaxy to another, you do that by folding the point because that's the most efficient way. So, from my
Two different
understanding,
technologies.
they're two different. They're both there, and they're both hinted at in these clever science fiction things that are sometimes more true than not, right? I mean, we look at Star Trek. It literally, I mean, it's the story of what's actually going on. There's a galactic federation. There's a prime directive where they don't interfere until the people reach, like on the planets, reach a certain level of technology. A fun thing about that is that, all right, let's go a little conspiracies, but President Eisenhower allegedly had a task force that was geared towards finding extraterrestrials when they had contact with extraterrestrials, known as Majestic 12. Now, one of the members of the Majestic 12, I believe, was his college roommate or something. So Gene Roddenberry had access to somebody that was on that panel. And then, of course, later on, he comes out with Star Trek. And it's like, well,
He got that
it
potentially got that
potentially
information.
got leaked down there, and all he did was make it human-centric. Instead of, it's basically the story is true, except we're the ones in the Petri dish being like watched by all these things, not the
Right.
ones who created the Federation like they do in the show. We're like one of the founding members of it.
So, can you summarize briefly, once more, the connection between this concept of aliens seeding humans and having DNA tampering and the esoteric description of how the races come down?
Right. Went
Yes?
on a little bit of a tangent. Okay, yeah. So basically, we look at the root races. So esoterically speaking, there is an ethereal race. That's what the Bible refers to as Elohim, the gods and the goddesses. That race then gave way to another. They all apparently like ascended as they could, right? Because they were beings of a fifth dimensional thing, so they couldn't ascend all the way back to the absolute. But they had some level of ascension. They probably were from the fifth dimension, the seventh dimension, became angels, whatever. That's what they're depicted in the Bible.
Just slow down for me. This is really important.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, but they were all successful. The first root race did not have like a cataclysm or whatever. It came down. They were the first one to see the planet. Then there was a second, also protoplasmic race that was still descended a little bit more, but still wasn't a physical, right? And they were the first one to end in some type of catastrophe, but it couldn't have been for a fall, right? Because the ego still hadn't yet been created. The ego couldn't be created until we descend to the physical. So it is said esoterically that this race ended in a fit of hurricanes or something. And we'll come back to that because that's important.
Okay.
Now, in the third root race, it was Lemuria. The beginning of Lemuria, the beings were still kind of, this is when they first descended to the physical, but the beings still started out as having both sexes. They were still, I guess, like a divine hermaphrodite, right? That type of thing. And then slowly over time during that root race, it was said that the genders split. And then that's also when the ego was created and animals were created. And it was said that that's when the fall, that's basically the Garden of Eden. That's when the fall happened. And even esoterically speaking, it said that some degenerated so much they started to cross with the animals that were on the planet. And then that's the Lemurian race. Then they were the first ones to fall into ego, and then they were obviously followed up by the Atlanteans and us, right? Now, the interesting is that thing about that is, and if we look at this concept of like extraterrestrials being on the planet, there's a very interesting tape called the Lacerda Files, which is an interview with an indigenous reptilian. Although, in this case, I would believe there would actually be an avian descent, because it was allegedly they evolved on this planet from dinosaurs naturally, so not being so they over a very long period of time, millions of years. So their ancestors were were dinosaurs, which would make them, I guess, avians. But whatever, they had reptilian skin. So because certain dinosaurs
So
are
it's
scaly.
something like us, but from a different
Yeah,
trajectory.
I haven't personally had an internal experience with these. The reptilians I've had experience with internally would be the Dracos, which are related to the Orion Wars, that I've experienced, which are off planet. But I have heard from viable sources that people that I trust, whom have similar, that I can corroborate their other internal experiences, because we've had similar internal experiences, and they've spoken on this type of thing. So I tend to trust the source, because the other things I can corroborate. So the individual has more experience than me, but everything that I have experienced, the person has also experienced. So then I trust the other information. I would say it's a fairly reliable source that these indigenous reptilians exist, and also the things that are in the tape pretty much line up what he's saying, right? So.
So what's a summary of what's in the tape?
Well, I was going to get to that. It's an indigenous reptilian, and it talks about the evolution of life on this planet. Mm-hmm. And this is where it gets interesting. So they talk about how the first, like back way even before the dinosaurs, there was one extraterrestrial race came here, and then, whatever, they left. Then they said there was another one that was here during the dinosaurs, and that who were their direct ancestors, and that those beings were attacked by another like a reptilian race or something like that, malicious other species came, and that's actually what caused the extinction instead of the meteor or the asteroid hit, which sort of lines up with that. Oh, there were like hurricanes at the end of this, and there was wars and hurricanes at the end of the second root race, right? Because they shouldn't have fallen from ego, they wouldn't have had ego, so they should have also technically ascended just like the first one. Why would they end in cataclysm?
So it was because of the attack.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Then there was all this time, whatever, and Lemurian time took a long time. But then there was a point where we get to, and this is the ancient astronaut theory, the ancient alien theory, which is that sometime during like the Garden of Eden or 200,000 years ago or whatever, that extraterrestrials crossed their genes with the local primates on this planet, which if we go to, like I said, in that third root race, it starts out as just like these divine beings, and then mm-hmm. there was the fall from Eden, the fall, right, where, esoterically speaking, that we fall into the ego, and then some degenerated enough they crossed with the animals being the ego. But what does that also sound like? Well, you have like the whole story of, we look at Sumerian mythology, and which is one of the oldest mythologies on the planet, even going back similar. It has a story of Genesis that's in the Old Testament, but it's older. And basically it talks about how Eden, instead of being a paradise, is this basically this concentration camp, and there's these extraterrestrial overlords, reptilian extraterrestrial overlords at that, right, that created man from the local fauna with using DNA and to mine gold, and they were still like animals. And then at some point, the god Enki, right, who also is most likely Poseidon and Osiris and other things, right? That god, I guess he felt bad for them, and then he, the serpent in the garden, right, gives them the tree of knowledge, right, and
or the wisdom and how
the
to
wisdom,
ascend.
right, the wisdom and how to ascend, right, and I think in the Old Testament, God says, don't eat from this, or then you'll know death, right? Because you eat from the tree of good and evil. But yes, you will know death because you get stuck in that dualistic thinking. However, you need that dualistic thinking. We talked about the Lucifer thing in a prior episode, but the Prometheus bringing in the fire, mm-hmm. the apple in the garden. It's like, yes, it's what causes man to fall, and it's that ego. And in this case, it might be that's the DNA being spliced into these animals that before the animals are just animals or intellectual animals, and then they add that gene that allows them to ascend, right? And in a sense, it's like we steal the fire from the gods and we give it to them. And why do they get expelled from Eden then at the point when Enlil, who was the Anunnaki name for that deity in Sumerian mythology or whatever, Jahwe, or in the Old Testament. Why does he expel them? Because he's like, oh, if they eat from the tree of knowledge, the next thing they will do is to eat from the tree of life and then surpass us, right? And we talked about how those first root races, being of a different geometry, right? They could only ascend so far. They started higher, but they could also only go so far. So like the Elohim, right? The fifth dimensional beings, they had their little ascension process. They become angels, but they're still trapped in the construct. The reason why we need to have this physical experience and come down into this quote unquote hell, right, is because you need to have this much of the density to push back to actually return all the way back to source. It's a reason why a lot of extraterrestrial beings or these superior beings, right, covet actually coming down to a planet at this time, right? We look at it as, oh, it's terrible, but when our beings, they fight over, like allegedly the beings fight over trying to get their human soul down during this time period because it allows for self-realization. That's only the opportunity to say, if this star system, all of the planets, esoterically speaking, actually have humanities on them, just in other dimensions, and if the being has to send his soul down to say Venus, well, that at the current time of the humanity that's on Venus, they're more advanced, but they can't do the work to get back and to achieve what the being wants. So they want to send it, and it's such a dense, hard environment that being has to be powerful to even be allowed to send their human soul down into this environment. Yeah, if their intention. So
to do that.
So it's all there, but yeah, in a sense, the pseudoscience stuff even lines up with it. And then we go even farther. I mean, we talk about the moon being a Death Star, right?
So for someone who doesn't know about that lore, because it is kind of fun, okay?
It's very fun.
So the moon is the moon, and in esotericism, there's the symbol that the moon relates to our mechanicity, and we need to, in our ascension process, overcome all things lunar, right? So what does the Death Star myth say?
Well, so basically, esoterically, as you said, the moon relates directly to our mechanicity. This is in any sort of tradition. Obviously, esoterically, they don't say that the moon is artificial. They point to the moon actually being from a prior epoch, another planet actually that had its own humanities at one point, and then it died, and that's what will eventually allegedly happen to this Earth and all the planets. Eventually, when they go through their full cycle, they will become moons for like another planet, right? But it's funny though, because like I said, there's always parallels, and there's always universal threads of universal truths. So when you talk to the pseudoscientists, and there's this concept of that the moon actually only goes back 12,000 years, and it relates back to, now we're talking end of Atlantis, right? So allegedly, the asteroid belt used to be a planet called Tiamat. There was a war. That planet got destroyed. And this caused magnetic flux or things like that in that area. And that caused, the cataclysm of the planet and everything to go out of whack. And that's why there were flooding and stuff. And that the moon was actually brought in at the time artificially to stabilize the planet. And then when they did that, the moon being an Andromedan biosphere, which is kind of like a space station, right?
So
the
it's
joke
artificial.
the joke of being a Death Star, but that it was the beings that brought it in because there were reptilian overlords at the time, right? Those reptilians who are of a lower density, we could compare them to, I guess, what demons, right? Like external demons, right? So they brought in this space station to stabilize the planet, and then projected the 3D matrix from the moon onto the planet to enslave the humanity, which lines up with the myth of the Edenic myth of the Sumerians. And then what happens then, and this, if we look at the Mahabharata, right, or even Sumerian myths, and actually a lot of the really older Eastern mythologies, is that there's a point in time where these reptilian serpents get defeated by the gods, and the gods that we look at as the humanoids, whether it's Krishna and all these and Shiva, or it's in Sumerian, it's just the Anunnaki defeat the old Anunnaki, and the new Anunnaki, they have the same names, but now they look like humans with beards, and they defeated the serpents, right? But there is that, right? There's that myth. It's in a few different mythologies. And allegedly what happens is that's the Galactic Federation came and kicked out the reptilians and their low density, and not completely out of it, but they took them out of power. And then basically the moon was left there to its own devices, and then basically we're now under our own like mass hypnosis with nobody controlling us, but just ourselves. It's our own consciousness controlling it. And then now, because it's been so long since it's been there, that the generator is failing, and that's why the fifth dimension is coming back through. Now, again, all of this is subjectivity. It's fun, but it does line up exactly with what's going on in esotericism. So why are these people seeing this? People with their lenses that maybe are contactees, and still having these spiritual experiences are seeing in some semblance that there's truth there, whether that's actually the truth or not.
But that would help explain why there's some people having spontaneous awakenings, and then those of us who are doing the work might go, hey, how come I've been working hard to self-observe, self-remember, dissolve my ego, and this is where I find myself now, and next door someone just has this sudden awakening and they didn't do anything.
Yeah. Well, like I said, we look for the objective truth. So yes, there has been a 3D hypnosis on the planet, and yes, the fifth dimension is actually coming through, and yes, the next race after this one finishes its manifestation will be a fifth dimensional race, and those of us who are able to connect to that vibration will be the ones that continue on through. So all of that is true. Like that is objectively, that's in esotericism. It's in the pseudosciences, and so that's why it's really funny to look at all of that stuff and like kind of you can see those lines. So it's like we could say, oh, these people are crazy, nuts, or whatever, and they're just seeing it through their own filter, but they're seeing the truth because the same story is there. It's the same story that's in every religion ever, right? There's always a rapture. There's a rapture or some type of event. I think in the Norse had like the Fenris wolf is going to come up and flood the planet, eat everything. So all of this in the Germanic Edda, right? So like all of these like apocalypse ending events all point to the same thing, which is that at the end of the three-dimensional race, the fifth dimension will come back through, and everyone who is not of the vibration of the fifth dimension and not moving back up will then be submerged into the hell realms or Avicii or the abyss or all of these things, right? Or they'll just perish from not being able to handle the fifth dimension. That's what the pseudoscientists say.
So it's still very important to do the inner work. We're not going to be saved by the failing moon. Right. There was another question I had because you mentioned blue people, and we know there's a lot of them in alien lore. And then curiously, you find beings like Krishna who are also blue. Of course, the alien enthusiasts, that connection was not lost on them, so they did focus on that and suggest that some of these blue beings in Eastern religions are actually aliens. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, that comes back to what we were talking about with the Arcturians. I think almost positively that's probably what we're looking at, right? I know I've personally had internal experiences where my spirit guides appeared to me as many beings from, I guess, the spread that you would call the Galactic Federation. In fact, before I had that experience, I wasn't super into the knowledge. It caused me to search and learn a little bit more about it. I had always been fascinated with ancient alien theory because there's clearly just something there. I mean, if we look back at ancient civilizations, and I mean, whether it's Atlantis or it's extraterrestrials or it's like both and one and the same, it clearly isn't what modern archaeology says. Like anybody with some common sense, it's like, well, how did you build these monuments, for example, that we can't build with modern machinery now? And they built it in like 20 days with like what just slaves. That's not possible, So like obviously, there was some lost technology, or they had help from somebody, or like I said, both, right? The answer is probably a little bit of both, right? But because the older civilizations did have better technology than we realized, and that was washed away. And then also they were in contact with extraterrestrial beings. But yeah, when we look at those gods, I mean, most likely it would be Arcturians. There is also, there's a race that is of the light being density that a lot of times most people who contact them see them as blue, and that just might be their subjectivity, maybe because we have an affinity for blue beings from the mythologies, but it could also possibly be related to that because we talk about Krishna being, he did have physical form as the avatar, but we talk about them being like, spiritual masters, which anyone who achieves mastery eventually becomes a light being. Those a lot of the times will appear as blue beings to many who see them. At a certain level, though, when you experience beings of the sixth dimension, you'll see them actually just as light if you're able to comprehend that.
And that's what they really are.
That's what they really are, yeah. Like now, the last 2 times I've had internal, and most of my experience is internal. I do live in the middle of New York City, so I can't say that I actually had a contactee external UFO land in the middle of Manhattan. I've never.
There's no helipad for them here.
Nothing like that. But I have had just internal experiences with beings of that nature, and really internal, external is the same from a certain level of understanding. Yeah.
Right. So if someone wants to contact these other humanities or aliens, what do they do to have a similar experience?
And there is practices for certain things like that. I do know that in the esotericism that we work with, there's certain mantras that can help us try to contact us, humanities from other realms, right? I've had luck with that, at least for triggering internal events. I know others, other brothers that have had been able to actually also summon external things, obviously in more rural areas. So I'm not going to say it doesn't work, but that's not my own personal experience. But I do know some that have. And it's a very powerful practice, and there's definitely something to that. But there's also other things too. I've seen in New Age. There's also, I think there's like contact meditations. It's also, I think when it comes down to things like that, it's like the intentions that we set, and if we get into a deep enough state that we vibrate at a frequency that we can connect to these beings. These beings are way more sensitive spiritually than us, because being more developed in that sense. So if we show that we believe in them, or that we at least are able to comprehend them and understand that, and we're pure of heart, they're not afraid to show themselves to us. They don't show themselves to the masses because it would probably cause a panic. But if
people would just try and attack them or something.
But if we begin to awaken and we're at a level that they understand that we can understand them, they will, let us know that yes, here's your evidence that we're here helping you, Pretty much, I mean, from my understanding, the majority of them are not malicious. And even if we say they're malicious, it's not malicious in the sense that we think of in the movies, like they're going to try to come attack us or take over the planet. The lower vibrational entities that are pretty much similar to how negative humans are on this planet, just at a higher level of the food chain, right? So they're responsible for like organizations, like everything happens in layers. So like it's just like we have governments here. There's organizing factors, for the solar system and the galaxy, and there's we have beings that care more about internal work than some that are more obsessed with the external, and that's kind of how it is there too. So they're more intelligent intellectually in an intellectual sense, but they are still trapped in the illusion of materialism and at their level. So they're just trying to profit for themselves. They're not like trying to eat humans or something or whatever crazy things the movies put. They're maybe just trying to get what resources they can from our planet before the planet wakes up more, because they're aware also of what's going on, and cracking deals with our government, taking advantage of our greed and our state right now to fuel their greed, because they're like smarter and greedy, like it's like that type of thing. They're egoic animals, but like they're not necessarily trying to come and harm us.
They're just doing what
they're doing what they
programmed to
do. Yeah,
right.
yeah.
So you talked a little bit about the beings that can and can't ascend, and this is specifically related to the different dimensions. Can you slowly, clearly unpack how that works?
Yes. So from my understanding, and also I've heard a lot of other people talk on this, that the only way to return back to source, so to do the work, is to move through a geometry of the third dimension to the sixth dimension, and then back to the void, which is the ninth dimension. It's that 369 geometry, and that means that you have to be a being that's living in the third density, have a revolution of consciousness that allows you to awaken to the sixth density, and then I'm sure that's something that's way beyond my comprehension. There's some type of work that a being at the sixth density then can do to return back all the way to the absolute. And get back to oneness, right?
So what happens to those beings that are in those densities in between?
Well, they exist and they're serving their purpose, and they're aware of it. They obviously have a much more heightened understanding of their place in the fabric, right? I mean, some of them maybe not. The lower density ones might be just like trapped in materialism, like how we are, and thinking
Just
that's
a different type
yeah,
of materialism.
yeah. And then that's why that event that we saw for, say, the Orion Wars happens, right? You have all these, beings that thinking that they need to break out of the universe because they're trapped in here. They realize they're trapped in a matrix, but intellectually they think they have to force their way out physically
Right.
because they don't realize that you have to do internal work. But a lot of them, it's not so much like, yes, they can't, say, move from like 5 back to 9. They can move from 5 to 7 or whatever, but they're still serving a purpose in the sense of those beings taking that path. It's related to when we talk about the spiral path, right? So where it's like they incarnate as a being like that, and then when they die, maybe they come back to the third density and then do some work, and then they do, and they make and in that sense, all these beings make things work. We think about, say, the fourth density is where we have elementals for like our plants and our animals and things of that nature, right? Your fifth dimension, you have the spirit guides or these other extraterrestrial beings that are working at a, galactic solar system type level to keep things moving, in the construct, even though they're not architects, And then even at the seventh density, which is outside of the construct, but that's where you're like angels, your aspects of divinity, those types of missions, right? So they're serving their purpose, and they are on a path, say, of ascension, but they always have to incarnate. They would have to incarnate back down into a physical body. That's why we talk about the angels that fall, things of that nature. We talk about the spiral path, right, where they live out their life during their physical life, or I guess it's not physical because it's not physical, but like during their their astral life, and they're living that fifth dimensional life. They're just their goal is to have their experiences, do whatever mission that they're supposed to do, and they don't.
As maybe
an
alien.
Right, but they don't have. They're not working the ascension path at that point. They actually work the ascension path when they go after they finish that life, and they come back down to the physical, and then they're maybe give some more teachings, in a sense of like. They can give more teachings in the sense of like, something like public to people of lower understanding. They live that life, and they then go again, and they move up in the sense of like how in the animal kingdom, right? We have to move to the animal kingdom before we get to the humanoid kingdom, and there's levels to that, right? Obviously, no one thinks that a mouse, for example, is the same as a lion, right? So as they do more existences, from my understanding, that astral level is sort of like that too, right? We have the fifth dimension has an astral plane, has a mental plane. So one time you live an experience of this type of astral being, and then you might live an experience up here in the mental plane. When you go back and forth, and then slowly you grow up, and then eventually they too will come out of the construct, but in a different way. It's not of a like an unplugging type moment, taking the red pill. It's like a slow, gradual evolution that continues to go. Although they do need to, at the human level, still become self-aware somewhat, right? They don't have to dissolve all their ego, but they have to at least wake up, because we're so asleep that we can not even walk in the spiral path, most of us, because we just aren't doing any work. You just have to do some work, and even for that.
But the fall is necessary, because if they're in those dimensions, at some stage they've got to come back down here.
Right, because they will still have karma, right? We all incur karma. The only way to pay off that karma and to dissolve those attachments that hold us to the construct is to do the work that we can do through this density, through transmutation, and also the ego death, which can only be done here. And then I'm sure there's also something that has to be done at the sixth density, like I said, to get back to the ninth density, but that's beyond my level.
We don't worry about that
yeah.
for now. Okay, great. This was all really helpful, because some people who maybe are engaging with a kind of spiritual discipline that's come from esotericism, so they're doing what we call the inner work, when they come across these alien theories, it can be disorienting for them, because they may have this perspective that it's either or. Either aliens are real, or this spiritual path that I'm walking is real. And what we've looked at is how both can be true, and they are true because it is our subjective lens that wants to categorize these frequencies and intelligences under a certain umbrella and put it into alien lore, or it could be under some other umbrella. And behind that, it is just energetic.
Yeah, all these things are one and the same. Even we have to understand that these extraterrestrial beings are all massively more spiritual than us. Even the dark quote unquote dark ones who choose to live their life in a material way and be intellectually heavy, right? Have access to their telepathic abilities and stuff. They at least they're aware of these like abilities and consciousness. They're just not interested in doing inner work because they're basically like the black magicians of the whatever
Of a higher
being
realm.
of a higher realm, right?
Right.
But yeah, no, like we're like the only ones that are like so removed from the connection to divinity, what be it light or darkness, because both actually come from divinity. So we're just lost, and
That duality
we're
keeps us
we're lost in
confused.
ignorance, But I'm surprised you haven't asked me about the insectoids or the
I was coming to that.
the Lyrans.
I'm definitely
Okay.
coming to that. I saved the best for last. But before we get to that, I also wanted to ask briefly about the Dracos, because there's a lot of fear and paranoia, and people, when they hear that, wait, your spirit guide was a Draco, or you mentioned the Anunnaki, that means, if I'm thinking dualistically, oh, you're a bad guy. Can you unpack that a little bit?
Yeah, so, well, first of all, with Anunnaki, right, there needs to be some clarification on what we're talking about, right? Because, in a sense, the Sumerians' word for gods was Anunnaki. And actually, their pantheon of gods, when it was the reptilian overlords in the older myths, or when they were finally defeated by the other, more humanoid gods, then just gave them the same name. They actually kept the same names and just changed the depictions. But they use the word Anunnaki. I think when we're talking about the modern species of Anunnaki or whatever, we're talking about those humanoid ones that probably would have overthrown them. Those tend to be, I mean, look, all races have up and down things. There's no black and white, no duality at that level. Even when we talked about the Orion Wars, right? It's like, yes, okay, mainly the Dracos are the bad guys. Mainly the Federation type ones are good, but there's actually like beings on both sides. Because just like we have, some people that want to do inner work and some people that want to be materialistic, we'd be like a race that's leaning like the reptilians, where most of us are negative, but there's some
Not all
positive.
of us. Got it.
And maybe like the Arcturians would be a race where most of them are positive, but there's also some that would be like attached to materialism. So it could go either way, just
Right.
like our race can, right? But yeah, the Anunnaki that we think of, so those humanoids, like Norse-ish looking ones, those would tend to be benevolent to us and actually they're at war with like the Dracos, still allegedly to this day, so they'd be like on our side against them, trying to protect us from that materialism thing. The thing with the Dracos, so that's the shape-shifting, like the chameleon, reptilian race. I mean, yeah, if we were to look at the Orion War subjectively, like it's Star Wars, which Star Wars actually, I think I mentioned, may have been slightly inspired by it. Like the Dracos would be the Sith, right? So they're the dark Jedi, right? Completely like using their power and strength, and the warrior class race looking to subjugate others and take what they can from people and resources. A very materialistic race. But I mean, they just do what they do. That's like their
Right.
programming. But yeah, the Draconians would be like mostly fifth dimensional, obviously dimension 5 and 7, right? Of this race that is very materialistic and a dark energy, but like of an astral race. And then the Anunnaki would be more akin to the benevolent species, from my understanding.
Okay. All right.
So would be also the Arcturians and the Orions and the Syrians. Most of those are like the big main players of that thing. In those fifth dimensional, those astral races that like come and interfere with us, those would be the ones that are the most, benevolent. Towards Pleiadians are another ones. The Pleiadians are the Nordic looking ones, right? The Norse. The blonde hair and blue eyes, right? All of those are more friendly to us, and they all mostly oppose the Draconians. But again, it's relative. There's good and bad of everything.
Okay, so now we come to the insectoids and the Lyrans, and so we know there's all these different alien races that have been reported from various contactees, and they all have unique things about them, and there's something different and special about the insectoids and the Lyrans. What's the difference?
So the interesting thing when it comes to insectoids and Lyrans, and remember we're talking about subjectivity when we're viewing them, and then these are beings that are generally related to the higher realms of existence. So we're talking about outside of the construct, like the Andromedans, for example. Now, the Andromedans, being from the Andromeda constellation within our galaxy, appear to most of the time to people as blue humanoids. But there is some semblance, although there's two theories on the insectoids. One is that they also could be like the Greys and like a humanity from the future where everything went quite wrong and then we evolved into these insects. That's one theory. And both could be true too, you know what I mean? It could, because just because these beings can look like the ant people that the Native Americans talk about that live underground, that might be future humans. And then those like mantis ones, which are the ones that people tend to attribute to the space ones that come down here that we don't know where they're from, or we allegedly think are from another galaxy, right? But I'm talking about the interesting thing is the mantis ones, the ones that look like praying mantis usually, and then we're talking about the Lyrans, which are the felines, which if anybody who loves Egyptian mythology knows there's been plenty of deities that depicted as felines. And when we talk about those two, the interesting thing is that we have allegedly, right, these species don't come from our galaxy, right? Now, the insectoids are said to come from another galaxy, and Lyrans are actually said to come from another universe through contactee things. And why I find that fascinating is in the sense of these are beings that are six-dimensional or higher, so I mean they're really truly beings of light. But we all tend to see them all as a certain way. And remember I said it could be how we perceive their energetic signature. Mind you, these are looking like things that are on our planet. So that just might be how our energetic signature puts them together, because we don't have a way of understanding their energetic signature. You know what I mean? Because they're from somewhere else. But the interesting thing is that we know, esoterically speaking, that when you go to other galaxies, that they can be organized by different laws of organization. And truly, if you go out of the universe, if there is a multiverse, which goes beyond even what esoteric wisdom talks about, then you could be talking about they have completely different laws of creation altogether, like just completely different math, right? If we say our universe is created in a law, there's a trinity, right? There's a duality with the binding force, and then that's organized into 7 rays, 7 chakras, whatever. That's where we organize, and then from the architects create our physical universe, the matrix, with an organization of 12 Olympians, 12 apostles, et cetera, right? But in essence, right, if a being comes from another universe, it could be organized, 5, 4, and 13 or something, right? It doesn't really matter, right? So it's interesting because obviously everything is still consciousness, everything is still energy, but if a being were to come from completely outside the construct, the energy would be foreign to us in our perceptions. So perhaps, and I'm going to use the word perhaps, it's that energy from another universe is always, to us, comes across looking like some sort of like big cat creature, or like perhaps the energy signature from like, I don't know, the Andromeda galaxy pursues through our eyes as like a praying mantis. Right. And that's not what they really look like. They're beings of light, but that's just like how, our brain makes sense of it. Because it is why is all the ones that come from another galaxy look like this, and why all those they have a similar look. Could also just be that's what their species look like, but
the multiverse is very interesting because in some of the esoteric writings, one of the masters, Samael Aun Weor, talks about when he went to the absolute and he did all this work to get there, and he went, I've come here. And then he noticed there were other beings that were from higher up that were hanging out in that space, and he couldn't comprehend them, and they were from way up, and they were going, we're going up now, see you, but you belong there for now, and we're going here, goodbye. And then up they went. So that suggests that, yes, we are on this path at this level going through the construct, but then what happens? Can you explain a little bit about going higher than that?
Well, I mean, it's an abstract idea, but in a sense, right? So we talk about how, so the physical manifest universe itself is already a construct within a construct. So our 3D reality is a construct within this 5-dimensional matrix that's made from the 6th dimension. And now what we're talking about is the entire universe itself, like the superior realms, and going all the way back to source, being like Kabbalistically, they talk about the Adam Kadmon. So let's say like that the absolute, that unity consciousness that we all are striving to get back to is really like another being that's living in another superior construct, and then there's a construct above that.
Does it end?
Who knows? That's what we're pointing to. But in that sense, then, if that's the case, and just how we're like a kind of a multiverse, right? We're all microverses within this one big universe. Well, then, if our universe is a universe within a multiverse like that with other beings, then all of those other universes are also beings that also probably ascend to some level beyond hitherto unknown, as Doctor Strange says in Infinity Wars, right? A direct experience with that, I maybe have had some abstract experience where I felt like I was hopping around the multiverse, but I couldn't tell you if it was like I was hopping to other individuals here or actually leaving the construct. You're talking about like just something that's so far beyond my level of comprehension.
Well, it's very interesting because...
Is it possible? Yeah, sure. I mean, I feel like the more, like we talked about consciousness being an infinitely expanding thing. So, if you ever get comfortable in what your reality is and you think you figured it all out, you're probably wrong. There's going to be another reality breaking experience.
If you keep going.
Yeah.
Right. Or you could stagnate at a certain point and again become absorbed in certain rules and things around you, and then you would stop expanding until you do again, right? But it is very interesting. It reminds me of that scene at the end of Men in Black where the Earth is shown, and then the scene pans out and we go to outer space, and it keeps panning out, and then there's just universes and universes and universes, and we talk about infinity. For infinity to be real, then that process has to be infinite, and consciousness can't stop. It can't have a limit on how far it can expand. It should be able to expand infinitely. So it's just an interesting idea, and it's helpful because it can remind us to not get too comfortable where we are, to become dogmatic, or to think that we know everything just because we've had some spiritual experiences and we've had some kinds of proofs at a particular level. Then we think we've figured out everything about the universe, when actually there are more universes potentially out there. And maybe some beings that have gone to a higher universe could then even come back down into here and incarnate here, and then they might have a different kind of experience or different rules because they've come from somewhere else.
There's certainly examples of that. I think of in if New Age, right? So Dolores Cannon, who created QHHT, has talked about having clients that when they connected to their being, that they were like, I don't know, from like the 13th dimension or something, like way out, like which would be akin to what I'm talking about. Like there's something beyond the void in the 9th dimension. The being of that person being literally like uncomfortable being even in a physical form, like having problems trying, like they just wanted to, have an experience all the way down here in 3rd dimension, and that like they were almost like not even compatible with the body, so the person was like very ill and stuff. That's why they even went into QHHT, like, oh, what's wrong with me? Why am I, I'm constantly in pain and all these things. And it's because they were some really, really, really high being that probably wasn't meant to come at that point all the way back down to here, like sure, they probably have to descend at their relative level, but apparently, they just wanted to see what it was like.
But then it's a subjective, like meant to or not meant to.
Yeah, well,
as well.
But either way, the person probably was having problems, and then it was found out that they came from like someplace outside. So there's some precedent for that. That there's people that have had experiences outside of that. But again, all of that stuff's subjective too. So what someone sees as the 13th dimension might be like dimension 7 for somebody else.
Right.
It's hard to say with those type of things because it's not people that are doing the inner work. So their understanding of what their being shows them, it could be, right? But it could also be that's just their understanding of something that actually is more within the realm of what we understand in esotericism, and it's being filtered. It's really hard to get good information. There's so few people in this construct that are doing the internal work, and then even on top of that, that have done the internal work far enough to really have, objective things to say. And then on top of that, when they get to that level, they don't necessarily divulge all the stuff that's going on, because there's a certain sense that not everybody should know it. So, yeah.
Right. I think this conversation has been very helpful in that we've covered so many different topics and ideas that people have been asking us about, and maybe they're in spiritual work and they just want to understand how all this comes together, so that now they can be encouraged in the work that they are doing and see that there is a beautiful design to the universe, and it all does relate and it does tie in together, and it all can be simultaneously true, and there's these different lenses that allow us to perceive in different ways. Before we wrap up, was there anything else you wanted to add?
Yeah, I think that's pretty good. Sorry if I disappointed anyone with not giving stories of like Thundercats fighting reptilians with lightsabers in another galaxy. But I feel like there's a lot of that you can find on the internet already if you're looking for that. You can go find an AI video that's 2 hours long that will turn our soul's history into Star Wars with, like I said, with extraterrestrial beings like that.
But don't expect to find the truth or wisdom in those
Exactly.
AI videos.
So, I put a little bit of what I did know. Everything that most of the things I'm talking about, except for what I mentioned, wasn't from direct experience. There's some I drew from it. I have had experience with most of these beings internally, including the fact that, as I mentioned, some of my spirit guides actually appeared to me until I started later seeing them as beings of light. What does that mean? And it's hard to tell you. At the time, they wanted me probably to look into the subject, right? And there's probably more relevance to it than I understand at this point for my story. I do know now usually I unless there's like some other message to it, a lot of times the internal masters will just appear as beings of light, or as whatever it is that they're trying to teach me something, right? Could be if like a Greek person or an Aztec person, right? Because there's some hidden meaning related to that mystery school. But at the time, that's what they appeared to me as. And I have had some downloads with just galactic structure of things, and seeing kind of just showing that everything's at layers. Right. And I mentioned that before, everything that happens to us in a country that is a political system, all that's happening at the solar system level. And it's okay. It's just how it works. These are all systems that we have to go through for our growth. Just like we have to go here, the fifth dimensional beings are working through their ascension process, and they need to have the same types of checks and barriers for them to have their experiences. So, of course, naturally, even at that level, there's things of that nature. But outside of that, I mean, I try to avoid getting into too much subjectivity with all that stuff, because you start connecting the dots, and, next thing, outside of saying, I have some relation to this alternate future event. Now, all of a sudden, I kind of look like Jason Momoa. That must be a sign. And I'm this merman from the planet Mintaka, which got blown up by the Death Star. That's now our moon. And this is my identity. So, you have to stay away from that. The intellect loves to co-opt these ideas and then start connecting lines. And it'd be so easy too. Because, right, I get this information, this intellectual information from a download, say, right? Then I have this internal experience where I'm just in this location. And that's objectively all that happened. Everything else is abstract. But it's so easy for me to now be like, well, I know this happened, this happened, this happened. Well, all this stuff goes together, so that must mean this. And I'm, a merman Jedi.
Yeah, and it's important to see where is the benefit. If a certain perspective is going to make someone absorbed in a story and lose their way, then whether that's true or not, I don't know how helpful that is to be caught up in that in the first place. But all of the things that we've talked about, we've discussed where the alien lore comes from, how subjectivity plays a big part in all this, and how these different ideas all converge in one universal thread, that is consciousness is having these infinite experiences. And for those of us who find ourselves on a spiritual path, we are doing a kind of internal work to head back towards source.
Yeah,
And
everything.
that's the most important thing.
Everything is a signpost, right? We say that the masters, right? We have to all do the work ourselves. The masters are a signpost. Well, religions are a signpost. Because, well, that's the old masters, what they left behind, got doctored a little bit. But still, if you go to a Jesus quote, maybe throughout the rest of the Bible, but like, what he said is still a signpost, And the same thing could be said. These extraterrestrial beings are more spiritual. They're a signpost. It's all an example for where we can be. And if we look at the hidden meanings in that universal thread that's everywhere. And like I said, even pop culture, creativity, artists, good art, all of it points to the same thing. And if we can discern with that, we can find valid things, everything. So it's not, it's easy to just dismiss stuff because it doesn't fit our beliefs or our narrow point of view. But really, if we open our mind to all of these things, and like I said, all these different types of religions, science, pseudoscience, the occult, all of these things, you start to see that everything is all really connected, and it's only really our closed-mindedness that has to be this way or that way, because really it's all the same way. And there's valid stuff everywhere. Obviously, like I said, yes, we have to sift through the subjectivity because those who transmit information will put their own filters on things most of the time, because most people aren't masters, and they're fascinated by whatever topic we're talking about. But if we could look through it at a discerning level, there's valid information everywhere. And if anything, it's confirmation that the universal threads are true, and that, like we said, we call it Gnosis now. They called it, Christianity back in the Piscean Age. They called it Theosophy in the 1880s, right? Tomorrow, or not tomorrow, but like in the future race, it'll go by a different name, but it's all the same thing.
I like what Greg Braden says. Consciousness is always speaking to itself. So the information that comes down from source, when we are open to it, we can see it everywhere. And we hope that this conversation, this topic, has been interesting and helpful for you. And as always, remember to be the light, be the change you want to see.
Yeah, remember to vibrate at a higher frequency and maximize your dharma for the collective. Love and light, everyone.
We'll see you next time.